get right into it. It's my privilege to host this webinar, Tradition and Transformation Through the Lens of Lasallian Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, with our presenters Alexandra Walton and Dr. Caroline Gittens. Alexandra Walton currently serves as the Director of Inclusion and Belonging at St. Mary's College High School, dedicated to creating a supportive environment where every student and community stakeholder feels valued and included. Alex is a member of the school's Administrative Council leadership team, where she leads initiatives that promote cultural competency and social emotional learning. With a doctorate in educational leadership for equity and social change expected in May 2025, I know she's working hard on it, from St. Mary's College of California, Alex combines her academic knowledge with practical experience in various educational roles. She's implemented culturally relevant training for faculty, developed inclusive community initiatives, and created support programs that address academic acceleration and student well-being. Before her current position, Alex worked as a community school manager at Emerson Elementary School in Oakland Unified School District, where she developed support systems for students and families in need. Her experiences as a social emotional learning counselor and a sports psychology consultant has equipped her with a unique perspective on the holistic development of students. Her commitment to fostering equitable teaching practices and supporting all students is evident in her dedication to professional development and community engagement. A strong background in counseling and community development, Alex Walton is committed to making a meaningful impact in the field of education, ensuring that every student has the opportunity to succeed and thrive. Dr. Caroline Gittens currently serves as the Dean of Kalmanatsev School of Education at St. Mary's College of California. Dr. Gittens shares a strong connection with the core values of transformative student engagement, academic excellence, scholarship, and spiritual enrichment in pursuit of servant-minded, purposeful leadership as represented in the animating convictions of the Catholic tradition of religious education. Dr. Gittens has championed faith formation initiatives, including a certificate program for Catholic Lasallian K-12 school educators across the U.S., and in July of 22, helped St. Mary's College School of Education launch the annual Lasallian DEIB Institute for K-16 educators in conjunction with the college's Office of Mission. Dr. Gittens has served as a consultant and external reviewer in higher education and corporate settings, providing organizational support in strategic planning, leadership, development, institutional effectiveness, and accreditation readiness. Dr. Gittens is an active scholar, consultant, and public intellectual known internationally for her work on the assessment of critical thinking and numeracy among youth and adults, and for the development of K-16 critical thinking assessment instruments, including Education Insight, Mindset, and Education Insight reasoning skills. She received her doctorate in social and personality psychology from University of California, Riverside, with an emphasis in psychometrics and human cognition. Throughout her career, she has thrived as a justice and equity-minded teacher, scholar, and academic leader with a record of accomplishment as an innovative, entrepreneurial, collaborative servant leader. A lot here. Ladies and gentlemen, you have two great presenters here. Without further ado, I turn it over to Alexandra Walton and Dr. Caroline Gittens.
We thank you so much, Phil. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. So thrilled to have you with us this afternoon. Perhaps the hardest thing on Alex and I is that we cannot see you, but we feel your spirit and your enthusiasm, and we'll have an opportunity throughout our presentation to ask you to engage with us a little bit by putting some ideas into the chat, just so that we can build community even in this short time that we're together. So I'm going to begin by outlining for us all what the agenda for our time together is. This webinar is loosely, I would say, based on some work that Alex and I have done through presentations at Huether conference. And so if you've participated in a Huether, you will know that that's a gathering largely of K-12, but sometimes also higher education educators and administrators and others who are very passionate about the Lasallian mission and pedagogy to come together to talk about various themes. And Alex and I have had a chance to give a couple of years of presentation around DEI, belonging, and that was what we used as our foundation when we built this webinar together. Today we'll be starting with a prayer shortly, then we'll do a bit of introductions of each other. You've heard a few things, but we'll just augment those a little bit to help you get to know where we are coming from today. We'll talk about the Lasallian charism, why DEI and belonging in particular are very much in the DNA of what we do as Lasallian educators. We'll talk about moving forward and how perhaps you could go back and build on either existing conversation or even just start conversation in your own communities around the themes that we're talking together today on. And then we'll leave you with some walkaway wisdoms, hopefully, that you can take and then personalize and make your own as you go forward in your work. So we'll begin by a prayer over our gathering. Let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God. We ask that you reflect for a moment on your motivation and reason for being here today. We are truly grateful for the chance to come together with you today. Heavenly Father, thank you for watching over us and granting us the opportunity to connect, learn, and grow. As we embark on this workshop, we dedicate this time to you, Lord. We lift up in prayer the presenters, attendees, staff, and volunteers who have made this event possible. Guide us as we forge new connections and seek the wisdom needed to fulfill the tasks you've given us. Amen.
All right, so hi everyone, welcome again. We want to start with a quote from Bell Hooks. And that quote is, "I dreamed about a culture of belonging. I still dream that dream. I contemplate what our lives would be like if we knew how to cultivate awareness, to live mindfully, peacefully. If we learned habits of being that would bring us closer together. That would help us build beloved community." So it's on the screen if you need to look at it again. But as you hear that or reread it, I'd like for you to put a word or two or a feeling that comes up for you in the chat.
Okay, we've already got some responses coming into the chat. 2 words that come up: hope, from 2 of our participants. It seems to be a running theme: hope. Peace and community, mindfulness, dreams, community, growth, inclusion, intentionality, mindfully.
So feel free to keep adding them in, but I'd like for us to recognize some of these words, hold on to these words as we're going through this presentation, this webinar, and to continue to connect us in this work.
Do you want me to go first?
Your pictures first.
Arguable. All right. Well, so we deeply appreciate the biography that Phil read for both of us, and we just would like to amplify some of the other personal characteristics that bring us to this work. And so I'll just begin by saying that I have personally been very much defined, I guess is the best way to say it, in terms of my interest in trying to help others who maybe don't see themselves in all the spaces that they are in or that they're struggling to join, to feel empowered to be there, to have their voice be heard, and to be recognized. And just as a person who has been traditionally in fields that may have been more represented by women in some spaces, I've also attempted to work in spaces, particularly leadership, where there are fewer women. And so my own experience as a female, as a leader, as a mom, and also as now a recent grandma is someone who is very much interested in thinking about how my gender presents and how I'm receiving others. I'll also say that as a white woman, it has been a walk that has been important to me, but also I approach with as much, hopefully, perceived humility on the other parts of when others have interacted with me, just for the privilege that I've experienced as a white woman, but also as someone who, again, just has spent a lot of time working in spaces where not everyone enjoyed that same privilege based on their race and ethnicity and how they are welcomed or not welcomed in the spaces. And so I just want to acknowledge that about myself. And I mentioned just lastly that I am a mom and I am raising I'm in an interracial marriage, mixed race daughter who also identifies herself as being an individual who will want to eventually partner with another person of her same orientation and same gender. And so really just trying to help navigate that space as much as I can, given what experiences I've had, and knowing that my experience is mine and I need to be open to the experiences of others.
Well, thank you, Carol. So again, I'm Alex, and I have always been drawn to this work for a couple of reasons. And there's two people on this webinar watching who are a big part of it. One is my husband. He and I have always been involved in helping those find their voice who can't in many different ways. He works with the American with Disability Act and has always been part of giving voice to those who don't have it. And my mom is also on here. And my mom was always like, you got to be a powerful woman. You got to stand up for others. And that is really also in my DNA. And I would also say my faith, being a Catholic woman, a Lasallian Catholic woman. I mean, it's in the Bible of how we are supposed to love and care for one another. Something else about me is I am a mother as well of 3 Black sons. 2 who have graduated from college and 1 who's a senior this year. And that is really, really my North Star, me and my husband's North Star. I want the world to be a better place for them. And this is not about who they want to be president, who they don't want to be president, where they end up in this world. It's really just about love and everybody having a place and sense of belonging.
Thank you, Alex, and welcome to the family and our new community of friends who are on this call. All right, so we wanted to begin. We have 2 main real purposes of our time together. Well, perhaps 3 when we talk about some of the ways you can bring this back to your where you work and where you live. But we wanted to talk about why diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly belonging, why this is truly Lasallian. And then we're going to, I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Alex, where she can give you a little bit even more historical grounding in some of the principles and ideas and social movements that are informing our practice as DEI and belonging educators. But I want to begin by talking about or sharing with you some of the words that were actually the words of our founder. When we think about what De La Salle and Jean-Baptiste de La Salle said over the years, through his writings, through his work with his fellow brothers and educators, there are themes that we think are discernible by looking at some of the quotes. And so on your screen, you'll see that we have excerpted certain statements over a collection of writings. We do our best to reference those on these, so that just to reflect the fact that there are more than one source document for these. And as I go through these, I want to ask the audience again to put some ideas into the chat. We're looking for you to help us to draw out what are the themes that you're hearing when you listen to the founder's words. So Know your students individually and be able to understand them. Show much kindness and love for the young people you teach. Have much care and affection for the young people entrusted to you. Take even more care of the education of the young people entrusted to you than if they were the children of a king. And you can perform miracles by touching the hearts of those entrusted to your care. So let's begin there. What key concepts are you seeing? What kinds of things? Maybe we could go back to that slide just real quickly. Thank you. Just want to get some ideas in the chat. What kind of themes are you hearing? What are you seeing? So the whole student, empathy. Thank you for putting it in faster than I can scroll. I love this. Recognizing that our students are individuals, that themes of love, themes of trust, themes of building relationship, and definitely the whole person is coming up. Thank you for recognizing that students need to be seen. We lay this out, we lay the words of the founder out as our beginning for the conversation of why DEI and belonging is part of what it means to be Lasallian. For this reason, if you are new to the network, or even if you've been walking as a Lasallian educator for decades, you know that so much of what we do has been the focus of writings, not only of our founder, but of many notable Christian brothers over the years, where particular themes just resonate, and there will be documents that come forward that drill down into those themes. There's many circulars, for example, which are pastoral letters that are meant, that are drafted and meant to uplift the spirit of the community of the Christian brothers. And there's many. There's one in particular that we wanted to draw your attention to. I'm smiling as I talk because these are not short documents. These are hefty and wonderful and rich documents that if you do pick up one of them and start to go through them, you'll see that there is so much to be taken from the words. Circular 412 is one in particular that resonates very much with our theme of this webinar. Circular 412, which is titled Educational Service to the Poor and the Promotion of Justice. It was written and disseminated in 1980, and it has some really amazing quotes in it, one of which you'll see on the screen. We must analyze the functioning of our schools. How do our schools really promote justice through their programs, their discipline, their structures, through the information that they circulate, the human relations that they foster, and in the ways they make decisions? How are we functioning in order to promote justice? That is this question. And how do we help our teachers better know the needs of their pupils? This question is absolutely fundamental to our work, not only in terms of what you were seeing in the founder's words, that care, the relationship, the trust, the seeing the whole student, the whole person, but in this particular call, we're asked to say, well, how is what our work and what is our work doing to promote justice? This particular circular, just to put it into some historical context, this particular circular was, as you can see from the screen, it was 4 decades ago. Many of us don't even think of the 80s as that long ago, but in fact, it was quite a long time ago. And it has in it a call to action. I want to just provide a little bit of other call or context to the circular. We can stay on this slide. But in 1971, so just a few years prior to the Circular 412, there was a Synod of Bishops, the 1971 Synod of Bishops. The Synod of Bishops is a gathering of bishops that is, meant to be advisors to the Pope. All the gatherings, or when they have General Assembly, there are themes. And in 1971, it was only the second gathering, the second ordinary gathering. One of the themes was on justice in the world. and truly it was a global gathering. It was a global question. What does it mean to have justice in the world, or to promote justice in the world? And in that time, in 1971, the document that was produced to represent the conversation of that assembly had, in part of the reflection, which says that the mission of the people of God is to further justice in the world. And in that case, at that time, they were even talking about affirming the right to a culturally sensitive personal development. That's what it was, the language that was being used at that time in the early 70s. We in 2021 celebrated the 50th anniversary of that document, of that gathering of the Synod in 71. The 50th anniversary focused tremendously on the look at justice, this call to justice. And so when we are forefronting here is that not only was the Synod 50 years ago, but the circular 40 years ago, it had a call to action in it that we can't lose sight of. And that is how we as Lasallian educators are going to engage in this call to justice and in this engagement of service to the poor and promotion of justice in our work. That was in fact the title of that circular and that call to action. We believe, Alex and I, and we would hope that you would also agree, is something we still are called to do on a daily basis. So one of the things that we have thought about together is how this is represented. How do we do this? What does it look like in our work? And one of the things we thought we'd put up is this familiar image. We hope that this is a familiar image, the 5 core Lasallian principles in font too small to read, we know, but one of the things that we wanted to identify, thank you, Phil, is that when we look at the core principles, our guiding principles, if you will, concern for the poor and social justice is one of them. And so is the respect for all persons. And we think that those resonate pretty loudly, showing respect for all, feeling that it is our shared and common commitment to caring for those, all of God's children, but also those in particular need, which are those who are suffering the most, and poor in a very inclusive and robust sense of the word, not only economically disadvantaged or disenfranchised, but all of the ways that we can suffer from a poverty in our community. But also we wanted to draw attention to faith in the presence of God and the idea that as promoters of inclusive community, you often see representation of an opening of our arms, of a welcoming, of a stance that everyone is welcome in our work, in our schools and in our communities of practice. So for those reasons, we feel that whether it is an individual's goal to try to figure out how to put principles of Lasallian pedagogy or other kinds of principles like decolonizing the curriculum, or whether or not you're promoting social emotional well-being in your role in your school, or as a leader in your school space or in your workspace, that these calls to action to bring forward more acts of justice, more acts of inclusion is something that we share that commitment together. So Alex and I took it upon ourselves to try and ask the question, how do we live into that call to action, to care for others through diversity, equity, inclusion in the promotion of belonging? So I think I'll turn it over to you, Alex. I'll jump in. Feel free to jump in
Yep.
As we get to the next stages.
Sounds good. All right, so the what and the why. And we've heard this term quite a bit lately, so much so it's become politicized, but these are not new concepts. This work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging can actually be traced back to the Bible. There are 2 particular verses I want to share. One is, therefore, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you. That's Romans chapter 15, verse 7. And then there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And that's Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. This work has been around. It is not new. So when we think about some social movements in history, if you could, this is our way of engaging with y'all. So we're asking you to throw it in the chat. It's because Carol and I are used to being able to walk up to y'all and talk to you. But if you could throw in the chat just some movements in history that you think could fall under diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Women's suffrage, civil rights movement, civil rights, LA and Denver walkout, ADA, anti-apartheid campus protests, Stonewall, Me Too, yep. So you could literally probably, Chicano movement, thank you, take courses on all of these different movements. So we're gonna dive a little bit into the history. And as I mentioned before, it's not a new concept. Y'all keep putting more and more stuff in there that speaks to this work having been around. It can be traced back to many key moments in history, as you all are pointing out, such as civil rights movement, Title IX, and Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, plus all these other things that it would have been too long of a slide for me to put on here. So let's take a look at how we even got to where we are with this becoming a little bit more politicized than we would like to state. So the historical context. So they have it has deep roots originating in the 1960s. And this is a decade that was characterized by the civil rights movement, anti-war protests, social upheaval. A lot of the things you all put in there were from the 60s and 70s. And if we were looking at the civil rights movement in particular, this was really to secure equal rights for African American and Black folk, and to end racial segregation, which had been legalized up until, in education, up until Brown v. Board in 1954. And really emphasizing also the need for diversity in educational institutions. And not just educators, but as we saw, students were really advocating for this as well. And they advocated for democratic policies and greater representation in curriculum, faculty, and staff, to the establishment, which led to the establishment of things like Chicano studies, Black studies programs, women's studies departments. And then after that, we see Title IX and gender equity enter. So the passage of Title IX, when a lot of people talk about Title IX, they talk about, this is where I would ask you to tell me. So throw it in the chat if you know what I'm talking about. As soon as you say Title IX, what do people say back? Let's see who's fastest. There it is. Oh, look who typed it in too. It's sports. So people usually think of sports. But it really was about prohibiting sex-based discrimination in federally funded educational programs, which then really significantly altered the dynamics in higher education, where we start to see a shift to more women entering in higher education. And it really contributes to women surpassing men in earning their degrees at that time. But of course, what happens then is we are a litigious society. So now we have more legal issues that start to come in, and there's legal and institutional development. So in the 1990s and 2000s, we actually see numerous lawsuits related to Title IX violations, which then results in the establishment of diversity and equity offices in higher education institutions. So it hasn't really filtered down into secondary or K through 12, but we're seeing it in higher ed. And then there's a diversity scorecard which gets developed, and that they want to measure how institutional effectiveness is supporting, what is the effectiveness of how they're supporting historically marginalized students. Then there is backlash. And in 2003, the Supreme Court, there's a big case at Michigan law, which is the Grutter versus Bollinger, but they hold and affirm that considering race in admissions actually promotes diversity when, and this has nothing to do, we're not going to get into if the candidate's qualified or not. They're talking about, it really highlights the social benefits of diverse educational environments. And I'm going to turn it over to Carol quickly to talk about another thing that came about was the how DEI was moved into institutionalized missions.
Oh, and I thank you, Alex, for bringing up this history, because I think we sometimes don't necessarily see how completely intertwined some of the progress and change in one space can then feed and serve as a catalyst for another growth in another area. In terms of the work that is being done across our institutions, I am there was a time where we saw quite a significant increase in the idea of putting diversity, equity, and inclusion into the mission of institutions, as well as the proliferation of diversity officer or offices of diversity and inclusion on college campuses. In the and particularly in terms of our Lasallian network, there has been some pretty ostensible work. You can either see it on the websites of the colleges, usually either in the offices of diversity, equity, inclusion, or, and where I like to see it also is how connected it is to the Office of Mission. But the idea of bringing the DEI work into the overall commitment as a campus to the great work that we do. So the connection to the mission. I just want to also acknowledge that, as many of you on this webinar know, that is under threat in our country pretty significantly right now. The ability to recognize diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in higher education, Alex, you mentioned in terms of admissions criteria, and but it's also showing up in the curriculum, showing up in the ability to have individuals who have identified positions and titles. And I'll just leave it with, it is a continual necessity on our part to continue to know how DEI principles are manifesting in our mission, in our strategic plans, in our organizational structures, as well as in our curriculum and in our student support programming. So, but there were some initiatives in the early 2000s to try to do a more ostensible integration, and now it is it's being challenged pretty actively.
So why is it being challenged? Well, we all can probably remember the shutdown and where we were in 2020. In 2020, protests erupted around the world due to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and COVID. And people started to call them the dual pandemics. There's research. And what everyone kept saying, I remember going to my children's pediatrician, and she said the amount of research that's going to be done on children and on academics and all of these things post 2020 is going to be fascinating. And she was right. There was a renewed interest, right? There's a renewed interest in diversity, equity, inclusion, and the post-scholarly interest in it. And what starts to happen is there are folks who are saying, okay, we really need to focus on this. And we're seeing this renewed attention, but what we also see are people saying, no, this has nothing to do with it. In fact, we don't want to talk about it at all. We just need to kind of move forward. And so we start to see Senate bills being passed. I see in the chat, we have Senate Bill 129. There's also, but on the other side, the Medina bill is passed in California, which requires ethnic studies to be a graduation requirement in California. So all of this to say, it's constantly changing, that it has gone from all those different movements you all put in, from the Catholic worker to civil rights to Chicano studies to all these different things, to now folks are here with it, instead of going back to some of those passages that I read that talked a lot about we just are children of God. We are just people who need to love one another. What we also find is a lot of the research is done and concentrated in some of the higher ed spaces. So for those of us in K through 12, we're not quite sure of all of the impact, except what we do know is if you teach, that kids miss some learning. And what we do know is if there are areas that are more marginalized and have tougher access to curriculum that's online when we all shut down, that we saw a widening of the gap, of the achievement gap. So all of this then leads to our B, our belonging. So belonging is a fundamental need. Those of us on here who are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it is a fundamental human need. I have not met the person who says, I want to feel like I don't belong. No one wakes up in the morning and says, let's get it. I want to feel like I don't belong. It's an innate human feeling, and we feel good when it happens, when we're in a stable and caring environment. Now, more specifically, we're talking about belonging in educational settings, which Goodenow 1993 has studied, and she's really looking at a sense of belonging not just being valued and included by the institution, but also oneself of feeling that they're an important part of the life and activity of the class. So it's more than just worth. It's that I belong here. So it's a twofold. There's oftentimes we always put it on the institution to say, make sure this kid belongs. We believe it's a twofold. We want, yes, there is that responsibility, but there's also responsibility for the student to be empowered with a skill set. It's a shared responsibility between educational individuals or institutions and individuals to foster a sense of belonging. Before we dive into the importance of belonging, one of the things to really think about when we're going to apply this to our own schools is, what does belonging look like in our communities? What do we need in our communities? And what I mean, I'll give you an example. I am at St. Mary's College High School in Berkeley. I'm not even going to ask you to put into the chat what you think about when you think of Berkeley, because people usually just say super liberal. So if you can imagine, our group that's smaller is our conservative students and our Republican students. And so I'm not talking about historically marginalized. I'm just talking about a smaller group of students who have come to me and said, sometimes we're afraid to express our opinion, or sometimes we feel like we don't belong. So I have to measure the belonging at my school and the needs at my school to understand, well, I need every student to feel like they belong. So let's take a look and see what needs to happen to make sure we have space for academic discourse across difference. So the research on belonging, I'm sure there are people on this call or webinar who've taken a look at it, but we know that a culture of belonging leads to positive student outcomes, positive mental health, positive wellness. We see a higher degree completion, we see higher academic grades, we see higher test scores, all the things. We also see that when belonging is not paid attention to, that there can be challenges for marginalized groups, women based on gender, based on religion, based on race. And sometimes when we don't address that, the lack of belonging can become a self-fulfilled prophecy. They already believe, well, I don't belong here. I am a female and I don't belong in an advanced math class because there's not a lot of me in that class and no one's ever told me I belong there. There's also so many different, as I started with, varied definitions and dimensions of belonging. And that can lead to diverse outcomes in educational context. And there was a study done in 2023 that identifies multiple dimensions of belonging based on the scale that you use as well, which is why it's really important to understand the belonging needs at your school. There's also something in the way of cultural capital and belonging. So those who have cultural capital, so maybe you're a legacy at your school, or maybe you're a higher socioeconomic status and you just have more influence and access, that can lead to higher success in education. So those from lower socioeconomic student backgrounds have often cited a lack of cultural capital, and that can get in the way of their belonging. And finally, identity and belonging. So who you are, how you identify, also impacts your understanding of belonging. So there's definitely a need for a multidimensional understanding of belonging that considers individual identity.
So I just really appreciate that you went through all of that, and I like that you gave that example. I'm thinking of some of the work that I've been doing. I want to just share with the group. I was doing some work with a high school, and this particular high school had just recently made the big decision to go from a single sexer to a co-ed educational model. And when I think about those points that you just made in terms of belonging, so much of that resonated with the community. At this point in time, they were about 18 months into the exercise, if you will, of welcoming. In this case, they were welcoming young ladies into the high school space that had been traditionally an all male school. And I think the point that you made that's really powerful is that the sense of belonging can have so much reverberation of impact, that it is the academic well-being, the emotional well-being, the social well-being, but it has, the other thing you said was the Maslow. And if you don't feel that you are, even at the base, most fundamental level, even welcome to be physically in the space you're in, you're not going to even maybe be able to satisfy the most fundamental needs that we have for safety, and for a sense of security. So as we think about belonging in our communities, when we think about what that roadmap looks like, I absolutely want to just echo the recommendation that you need to think about, well, what does belonging look like in this community? Who are the members of our community? What kinds of identities are they bringing? When you talked about the identities and belonging, and how do we understand who has cultural capital in this space, and how we might consider different ways of understanding and defining this belonging. In order to think about this roadmap, I was, and one of the things that you probably gathered is that between the two of us, myself working more in the higher education Lasallian space, and Alex, at least at this point in her career, having much more experience in the, well, really truly K-12, the idea of how belonging is showing up in our various spaces, in our conversations, and in our materials was something that I was interested in. St. Mary's College of California on the West Coast is one of 6 Lasallian colleges, at least in the United States. So I started there, and I wanted to look at, well, what would the roadmap, or what does the roadmap to belonging look like at our various higher education campuses? And I was quite happy to learn that there are many ways that this is showing up in our communities, or at least the endeavor to have the conversation about DEI is showing up in our communities, whether it would be at places like Christian Brothers University, where they're talking about the mission, the Lasallian mission, and linking it to working in providing a humanizing and Christian education that emphasizes the Christian brothers' commitment to be together and by association. I think we sometimes don't even appreciate how that phrase, together and by association, is fundamentally an inclusion stance. And so, and some of our other campuses have also developed centers that focus on the Lasallian commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I say all that to say that when we think about the roadmap, when we think about what does moving forward look like, it really is about how we can actively cultivate that space, that sense of community, that ability to have conversations, which are not always easy to have, to think about what it would look like. If I hearken back to the call that we saw in Circular 412, to really deeply analyze our practices, how we are functioning, how are we delivering our curriculum, how are we making decisions that are centering justice and DEI, and ultimately for the pursuit of belonging. So one of the things that we thought we would do to bring this home, if you will, for the webinar, is to start to ask the question about, how do we move forward? And I'm a big fan of quotes as well. And we thought that this particular one, I think, Alex, for finding this from Justin Lee, arguments alone do not change minds. Particularly salient, certainly in election years, but constantly true. A good sound argument isn't necessarily the thing that's going to change our minds. And we do want to say that it isn't going to be one interaction or one conversation or one meeting or one webinar that is going to lead to the changing of our hearts and our minds as we look out at our community or look inward in our practice to think about how are we or how am I promoting justice in my work. But it's about some other skills that we really wanted to spend some time with you. So give it back to Alex.
Yes, for those of us who are parents, we know arguments don't change minds. So one way that we can do this is really through dialogue and listening. I cannot tell you all how many times I have been contacted lately about the elections are coming. We need to figure out how to have dialogue across difference. And so this is a framework from Justin Lee, who has a book called Talking Across the Divide that we're going to walk through. And like you heard earlier, this is being recorded, so all of the steps will be on there. So the first step is preparation. So we got to prepare. We can't just dive into some of this. So what is our goal? Are we going into this conversation thinking I'm going to change their mind? Or are we just providing a space for brave dialogue with respect? What might we need to take into consideration? Learn whatever is at stake, both issues. Get to know our audience and get yourself ready emotionally if you are going to be the one hosting this conversation. And prepare the audience. What might the audience need to take into consideration, and prepare the participants? Set the stage for productive dialogue. So maybe you're saying something like, dialogue is not saying everyone is equally right, and it isn't debate or argument. It's a chance to hear one another out and seek to build understanding while acknowledging that sometimes we are trying to change each other's minds or just ask each other to listen. We want to find a space that's neutral, that's relaxing. And sometimes you want to think about your own background. What are you bringing in with you? Is this about an argument between two boys and I'm the mother of twins? So do I need to bring someone else in there with me to have another adult there to say, hey, this might get a little touchy or personal for me? So really knowing what you're bringing also. The next step once you prepare is the dialogue. Now, a lot of this is really the listening piece. A lot of this has, for those of you who might be familiar with restorative justice, there are a lot of elements of restorative justice in this. And it's an information gathering process more than a talking process. You are hoping to get both people or both sides, or whoever's involved, to listen. If you, as potential moderator or as the person who has to be part of the dialogue, begin your conversation by listening instead of talking, right from the start, you're setting a tone of cooperation rather than antagonism. And being listened to lowers the intensity. I think about my youngest son, who was always trying to jump into a conversation of 5 people, and he was the youngest, it's like double dutch. You're waiting to get the right one and jump in. And when he was able to talk and be listened to, it makes it more likely for the listening to be reciprocated. But things to think about. What do you want? What do they want? What's important to them about this issue? What do they believe? What do both parties coming in believe? What misconceptions might they have? We know our students get a lot of their news from Instagram. So what might they believe, or what might they have seen on news in an era where our news is very sensationalized? What do they think each other wants versus what do they understand about the priorities? As I mentioned earlier, what are their sources of information? What language do they use? So if I have to have a talk with a millennial, I am not a millennial. I am Gen X. So my conversation and my language is going to be a little bit different. So understanding and coming to terms with some shared language. What might they be worried about? Fear is a strong motivation. I constantly tell my students, your parents, we operate from a place of fear. We want you to be safe. We think about all the bad things that can happen. And this also happens in dialogue that goes wrong. All I am afraid of is what I might lose. So really understanding what each side might be worried about, but also what do we have in common? Venn diagrams go a long way with students or with each other. Old school method, but what do we have in common? See that right in the middle, because then it humanizes each other. And now we're back to seeing each other from care and from alignment. Once we have those pieces, and once we've had the conversation, always offer space to reflect. Keep the goal in mind during the whole conversation. If it starts to feel like it's getting emotional or turned down, have common signals. It feels like this is getting very emotional. Let's take a minute and breathe. Let's take 5 minutes, or maybe let's come back to this. As Carol mentioned earlier, this isn't a one and done. This may be a couple of sessions. There have been restorative justice circles I've done before that have lasted over sessions. And it's okay to walk away and feel unresolved, but more importantly, that you felt heard. So it's okay to come back together over and over again. And something that I want to wrap up with for this is Brother Superior General Armin, who's in Rome, asked us to have radical availability, asked us to be ready to sit in some of these uncomfortable spaces, because part of our vocation is doing this work for young people. And finally, repeat, 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 repeat. How many times do you have to tell your kids the same thing over and over? Many. You can tell where I am in my life right now. But it's okay to have to repeat and have the conversation over and over.
I think I might have been one of the ones who also said we really need to emphasize this point of repeating too, because as we all know, when we have conversations and you move to a new space with new people from your community in that dialogue, some of the things you'll learn in that next conversation makes you need to be open to continuing to have dialogue and possibly even going back to the first group. And certainly those of us who find ourselves in formal or informal leadership roles know how important it is to always be open to these dialogues. And so we promised some walkaway wisdoms, and we thought what better than to give you some of the words from leaders, in their own words. How do they approach the promotion and the thinking about belonging, and what is some of the strategies that they feel are that do work? And so in that regard, we felt that they were pearls of wisdom. So one of the things that we want to do, and these are from real leaders, from real individuals who were interviewed and asked to give some thoughts about how they promote having good conversation, dialogues, especially around difficult topics, and then also promoting belonging. And so, modeling what you want to see, meet people where they are individually, again, seeing them, helping them to feel seen. So meeting them where they are individually, and galvanizing the power of conversation and relationship, really leaning into those connections and trying to be as collaborative and transparent as you can, trying to avoid surprise or being blindsided by information. So we thought that those were fantastic. Just a few more on the next slide. Trying to ground your work, and especially if that work is going to lead to change, to ground that work in the values and the principles of your organization, in those Lasallian core principles in the Lasallian charism. Making sure that you're building in time for reflection. And as Alex said, most people, when they're having a difficult conversation and maybe facing what they feel is a threat to lose something or to have to do something differently, then what really benefits them is moments of time for reflection, as well as you having time for your own reflection, and then making sure that folks feel safe. So really kind of repeating some of the principles that we've talked about, and making sure that the folks that you work with and that you are around on a daily basis, the students, the peers, the colleagues, the families, the community members, the partners that you work with, our broader Lasallian network, helping that everyone know that you feel important, and that you recognize the importance of them, that they matter to you, you feel their importance. So we really wanted to give you some of those walkaway wisdoms. Hopefully they really do resonate with the principles and the ideas that we focused on. We have pretty much come to the point where we want to say thank you and open it up to any questions or dialogue. Obviously, a little bit, we're going to have to rely on the chat, but we're happy to take questions. Most of all, we just want you to know we are so grateful that you gave of your time today to be with us, and we appreciate you for doing so.
Thank you so much, ladies. This was jam-packed and fantastic. We did get a question a little earlier on from Spencer Shively. What are some good, reputable tools to measure belonging? In particular, looking for ones that produce actionable feedback. It's a great question.
There's a couple different ones. So we last year out of San Francisco, New Orleans, partnered with Springtide, and Springtide and Larry, Lasallian Education Research Initiative, they do a belonging survey that really ties into our Lasallian core values. So we have that. We also partnered with Stanford's Challenge to Success, which also does one. You can also do something informal yourself, which we've done as well, because while SFNO is paying for, I'm sure, the Springtide one, the Challenge to Success we had to pay for. But we are, so I just saw we are tuition-free middle school, and every year we do a belonging survey. So we've taken some questions from the California Healthy Kids Survey. There's different things out there, and we've put them together. And then as a team can look at it and say, okay, here's looks like the kind of action steps we need to take. Phil is going to put our emails out there. So please, I think it was Spencer, feel free to contact me directly, and I can give you a couple of more specifics. Oh, there they are.
Thank you, Alex. And
I got you covered, don't worry.
fantastic. In the higher education space, usually people use the National Survey of Student Engagement, or the NSSE, and other instruments like that have been more and more equipped to provide the kind of feedback that gives a sense of how students are feeling connected to the college campus. And I really want to echo what you said, Alex, about not to be afraid of trying to develop some of your own ways of collecting information about your community, so that it can help you get some input on how that sense of belonging is going among the different constituencies of your campus.
Excellent. Thank you. We are coming right up on our hour, and I can't thank you ladies enough for, like I said, this jam-packed and very informative webinar. There's so much here to take with us. So I think we'll end it here. You do have Dr. Caroline Gittins and Alexandra Walton's email addresses in the chat, so please take those with you. And then, like we said before, we do have the recording coming, and we'll get that to you and have those resources on lasallianresources.org. We are grateful to you, the two of you, Alexandra and Caroline, for your time today and sharing your wealth of knowledge in this growing and necessary field of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We're actually from CBC really grateful for Caroline and Alexandra's leadership and knowledge that they're going to be bringing to Huether, the Huether Lasallian Conference. It'll be hosted in Baltimore at the Hyatt Regency Inner Harbor, November 21st through 23rd this year. Our higher ed colloquy will be kicking off the day before on the 20th, and Alexandra will be presenting a breakout session talking across the divide. So this is a great opportunity for some more in-depth DEIB information, so be there in Baltimore. More information is on lasallian.info. For some, DEIB may be a new lens through which to look at our educational ministries and institutions and the spaces we provide for our young people to feel welcomed and supported. Truth is, and so powerfully shared by our presenters this evening, the Lasallian educational mission is based in DEIB, if you will. He may not have used the same terms, but it was certainly part of the charism that De La Salle and his first brothers formed more than 300 years ago. And today is made clear in our core principles and in the way we conduct our ministries for the young people entrusted to our care. just incredible what a history of work that we have, the mission that we are part of. If you have ideas for future webinars that you'd like to see, subjects that are important to you, like us to cover, let us know in our social media channels or email me, pderita@cbconf.org. Also check out the rest of our webinar series. I'm dropping that link into the chat as well. And then, of course, we have our kickoff here in September, but don't forget, we also have our next in October, the next installment of our fall webinar series. We're talking vocations. Join us at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific on Wednesday, the 16th, for Fostering a Culture of Vocation, the call of everyone within our Lasallian family, with presenters Brother David Coretti, FSC, and Mr. Chris Swain. You can register on our website, lasallian.info. And like I said, the direct link is there for our webinar series. So make sure you have that in your calendar and you will be joining us. Again, thank you for being with us. Thank you for all you do for our young people, making them feel welcomed and part of our communities, giving them the space so that they are truly a place where they belong. Blessings to you and all you continue to do in serving this awesome Lasallian mission. Proud to be with you tonight. And with that, I close St. John Baptist de La Salle. Pray for us.
Pray for
Live
us.
Jesus in our hearts forever.